They were outside before breakfast and home before dark. Nobody tracked them. Nobody checked in. The freedom was real. And so was the silence that came with it. They learned the neighborhood before they learned their own feelings. And for millions of people alive today, that order never quite reversed. There is an entire generation that grew up with extraordinary physical freedom, and almost no emotional infrastructure to match it. They could navigate 3 square miles of neighborhood by age 9. They could negotiate with older kids, read danger in a stranger's posture, and find their way home from places their parents never knew they had been. But ask them what they were feeling on any given afternoon of that childhood, and the honest answer for most of them is that they genuinely did not know. This video is about what that imbalance built, what it cost, and what it quietly, durably continues to mean. The standard narrative around unsupervised childhoods in the 1970s and 1980s tends to split into 2 opposing camps. The first is nostalgic. Those were the golden years of childhood freedom, and modern helicopter parenting has robbed children of something essential. The second is critical that freedom came at the cost of emotional neglect, and the psychological gaps it created have never fully closed. Both of these positions contain real truth, but neither of them is complete, and the complete picture is far more interesting than either camp tends to admit. Picture a boy, 8 years old, in the long, unstructured sprawl of a July afternoon somewhere in Middle America. He is not in danger. He is not being neglected in any dramatic or reportable sense. His mother is at work. His father is at work. His older sister has somewhere to be. And he is outside with 3 other kids from the block, building something complicated and argument-prone in the drainage ditch behind the Kowalski house. Nobody is facilitating this. Nobody is processing it. It is just happening, and it is magnificent, and it will leave absolutely no emotional record because nobody taught him that experiences like this were worth recording. That last detail is the one that matters most for understanding the psychology of this generation. The experiences were rich and varied and genuinely developmental, but the reflective layer, the habit of examining experience, of naming what it produced emotionally, of converting living into understanding, was almost entirely absent. Research in narrative psychology, particularly the work of Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, consistently finds that the ability to construct a coherent personal narrative from lived experience is one of the most robust predictors of psychological integration and long-term well-being. These children were accumulating extraordinary experiences. They just had no framework for making narrative sense of them. The emotional gaps did not feel like gaps from the inside. That is the part that requires careful explanation and that is most frequently misunderstood by people who did not live it. You cannot miss emotional scaffolding you never knew existed. You cannot grieve the absence of a vocabulary you were never introduced to. These children were not walking around feeling emotionally deprived. They were walking around feeling competent, capable, and largely fine. The gaps would only become visible later, in the specific contexts, romantic relationships, parenting, therapy, crisis where the missing infrastructure suddenly and conspicuously mattered. Developmental psychologist Diana Baumrein's foundational research on parenting styles described authoritative parenting as the combination of high warmth and high structure, and consistently found it produced the best outcomes across multiple developmental domains. What the unsupervised generation experienced was often something different, not authoritarian, not neglectful in the clinical sense, but functionally low on the emotional attunement dimension specifically. The warmth was frequently present, the food was on the table, the roof held, but the attuned emotional mirroring that Baumrein and later researchers identified as critical to emotional development was often sparse, inconsistent, or simply not part of the cultural operating system. What attuned emotional mirroring actually means in practice is worth slowing down to examine. It means a caregiver noticing not just that something happened to a child, but what it seemed to produce inside them. It means reflecting that observation back in language you seem frustrated. That looks scary, I could tell you were proud of yourself. This reflection does 2 things simultaneously. It validates the internal experience as real and worth acknowledging, and it provides the linguistic mapping that allows the child to identify that internal experience for themselves next time without needing the mirror. Without that consistent mapping process, children learn to navigate emotion through behavior rather than through language. Navigation through behavior rather than language is not inherently pathological. In many contexts, it is extraordinarily effective. The children who grew up unsupervised became experts at behavioral self-regulation at channeling energy into activity, at using physical movement to process emotional intensity, at reading social situations through behavioral cues rather than verbal ones. These are real capacities with real applications. The problem emerges not in any single high-functioning context, but in the specific situations that require the other thing, that require sitting still with an emotion long enough to articulate it, to examine it, and to share it with another person without converting it into action first. The physical world was their primary teacher, and it was in many ways an extraordinary one. Falling out of a tree and landing wrong teaches you something about your body's relationship with gravity that no classroom can replicate. Getting into a genuine argument with a friend over the rules of a game and having to negotiate your way back to playing together teaches you something about conflict and repair that no adult-facilitated mediation session fully captures. Staying outside until the light changed color and feeling the specific quality of that particular dusk teaches you something about time and beauty, and your own smallness that is difficult to name and impossible to fake. Neuroscientist Jack Panksepp's research on the play system in mammalian brains offers a compelling biological framework for understanding why this mattered so much. Panksepp found that the drive to engage in free, spontaneous, rough-and-tumble social play is one of the most ancient and primary emotional systems in the mammalian brain, and that its expression during development is critical for the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, social cognition, and emotional regulation. The children who grew up unsupervised were running that system at full capacity every day for years. Their brains were being built through play in ways that structured environments with adult oversight frequently interrupted or prevented. But here is the gap inside the gift. Panksepp's research also found that the play system interacts with other primary emotional systems, specifically the care and panic, grief systems, in ways that require emotional attunement from caregivers to integrate fully. Free play builds the architecture, but it is the attuned adult response to the emotional residue of that play, the big feelings it generates, the conflicts it produces, the fears and triumphs and humiliations that come with it that completes the developmental loop. Without that responsive attunement, children learn to run the play system in relative isolation from the emotional processing system. The activity and the feeling of the activity remain two separate and only loosely connected things. This is why so many adults from this generation describe a specific and consistent phenomenon in their emotional lives. They can function under enormous pressure with apparent calm. They can solve complex problems while others around them are destabilizing. They can organize a crisis response almost without thinking, but ask them afterward how they felt during all of that, and they frequently cannot tell you, not because they are hiding something, but because the connection between the doing and the feeling was never fully wired. The action system and the emotional system run in parallel rather than in integration. They are competent in the moment, and then quietly bewildered afterward by the gap where feeling should have been. Relationships were the first place the gaps became structurally visible for most of this generation, not because they were incapable of love or connection, they were not, but because intimate relationships are fundamentally built on a specific kind of communication that requires all the skills this generation was never given the tools to develop. They require the ability to identify an internal state before it becomes a behavior. They require the ability to name that state accurately enough that another person can understand it. They require the ability to remain in the discomfort of emotional exposure long enough for actual intimacy to occur. None of these were in the curriculum of the drainage ditch, or the empty afternoon. Attachment researcher Mary Main identified what she called earned secure attachment, a category for adults who did not begin life with secure attachment, but who, through reflective experience and relational work, developed the capacity for it later. Research consistently shows that the path to earned security runs almost entirely through narrative, through the ability to construct a coherent, emotionally integrated story of your own childhood that acknowledges both what was good and what was missing, without either idealizing or catastrophizing it. This is the developmental task that many adults from the unsupervised generation are quietly working on right now, often without knowing that is what they are doing. The solitude that came with all that freedom was not always peaceful. This part tends to get romanticized in the nostalgia version of the story and ignored in the critical version, and it deserves its own careful attention. There were long afternoons that felt like waiting for something that never arrived. There were weekends that had a specific texture of loneliness that could not be named at the time, and still resists easy naming now. There were moments of being frightened by something, a sound, a thought, a situation that felt suddenly bigger than an 8-year-old should have to carry alone, and there was no one available to bring it to. So you carried it, and then you kept carrying it, and eventually you forgot you were carrying it at all. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk's research on how the body stores unprocessed emotional experience offers a framework for understanding where all that unacknowledged carrying eventually goes. Van der Kolk found that emotional experiences that are never verbally processed and narratively integrated do not simply dissolve. They are encoded somatically in the body's nervous system, in chronic tension patterns, in the specific ways stress activates fight-flight-freeze responses that seem disproportionate to current circumstances. The unsupervised generation frequently describes this in exactly those terms, even without the clinical vocabulary. They know there is something stored somewhere. They just cannot always access it through language. And yet, and this is where the complete picture becomes genuinely important, something else was also stored somewhere, and it is not given nearly enough credit in the contemporary psychological accounting of this generation. Every afternoon they managed themselves through, every conflict they resolved without adult intervention, every fear they survived quietly without an audience, every creative solution they invented, out of boredom and necessity, all of that deposited something into a psychological reserve that has been funding their adult lives ever since. The reserve is real. The cost is real. Both are true simultaneously, and the truth of one does not cancel the truth of the other. What the world needs right now from this generation, and what this generation can genuinely offer, is exactly the combination that their unusual upbringing produced. They have the functional competence that comes from years of unsupervised self-management, and increasingly, many of them have done the reflective work required to close the emotional gaps to build in later life the narrative and emotional integration that was missing in the early chapters. The ones who have done both are quietly remarkable, competent and self-aware, independent and capable of genuine intimacy, resourceful and emotionally present. It is a combination that neither pure freedom nor pure emotional scaffolding alone would have produced. The children who grew up unsupervised were given an extraordinary gift and handed a significant gap at the same time, and most of them have spent their adult lives doing the quiet, unannounced work of holding both, without letting either one be the whole story. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the exact kind of psychological complexity that produces the deepest and most durable kind of human maturity. The freedom was real, the silence was real, and the person who grew up inside both of them navigating, adjusting, quietly becoming that person is real too, more layered, more capable, and more worth understanding than any single narrative about their childhood has yet managed to fully capture.